All right, thank you very much for coming to the seminar. We are very lucky to hear from David. He has a lot of experience in a lot of places. You should read his bio. Too many places. I can see you're laughing. Maybe that involves some traveling. We are going to listen on a very timely topic, which is tariffs. So up to you. This will be 40 minutes with no questions, and then we will have questions at the end. We will have at least 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Firstly, let me say, well, I'm glad to be back here. I have a long history. I actually did some undergraduate courses in this department, and at one point I had David Pannell's job before he came here as a lecturer, and now I am an adjunct helping various people, students with their work. So I'm glad to be back, and this is a very topical issue. For those of you who listened to the news this morning, you may have gathered that Trump's tariffs are the most important economic issue facing the world today, or at least that's what you might assume if you read some of the analysis in the world. I'm going to tell you a couple of things about that. Two main messages. First, it's not a catastrophe. It's not even a disaster. And there are opportunities for Australian producers of livestock, grains, and so on. The other point I want to make is there's some policy issue about whether countries should retaliate against Trump's tariffs, and the EU, Canada, Mexico, various other countries decided that's the way to go. I will convince you that that's not a good idea, at least from an economic point of view. So they're the two main messages. Don't retaliate. Masterly inactivity. It's not going to be a disaster. There are opportunities for some of us. So here are the questions we asked. We want to quantify, the impacts of these problems. Initially, I was working with a UN organisation, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. They have a particular perspective. They asked me they helped me with providing some of the data. They also said, we'd like to know the impacts on least developed countries and the small island developing states. And of course, because I'm standing here, I said, well, we should at least include Australia in the model. So when I'm telling a story, I can mention how countries like Australia and Canada, Mexico, particularly China, how they're affected. What do we want to know in particular? So what are the trade impacts? We quantify those, they're fairly big. What happens to GDP? Are we going to have a recession? Are there large losses? There's concerns about inflation, and particularly what that means for interest rates. And you may recall last month the Reserve Bank in Australia did not reduce interest rates, even though inflation was low, unemployment was pretty much where it should be. But the notion was, well, there are uncertainties out there, and that's why we want to keep interest rates on hold. Now the thinking is, well, tomorrow, next week, they probably will reduce interest rates. But these are the uncertainties that the Reserve Bank was worried about. So we want to know the effect on inflation. The other thing is, particularly in America, Trump was concerned about employment, particularly on the people who voted for him. And these are people, particularly in the rural areas, who feel, their industries have gone, they have nowhere to go. They blame China for that. So we want to get we want to quantify the impact on some of these regions and see, whether this is a regional issue. Trade deficit, That's something that the US administration was concerned about. And as I say, we're going to talk about should we retaliate or not. Okay, so does Trump have a point? His objectives were to raise revenue. And partly this was to offset income tax, which he thought was too high. He would like to lower the tax. He thought he was raising revenue from other countries, that other countries would basically pay for that. You know, does he have a point? Well, we will look at that. He wanted to reduce the trade deficit, because America has been running large trade deficits, China running a large trade surplus. So that was one of his points. As I mentioned, regional employment. And of course, he wanted to make America great again. Fair enough. We'd like to make Australia great again. So he has these objectives. So the way I categorize this, he's identified the problems, but he hasn't got the solutions. So he's trying the wrong policies to address these problems. In particular, there's the China problem, right? So for several years, I worked at the UN in Geneva. We looked down literally and figuratively on the World Trade Organization. And it turns out that the World Trade Organization is pretty much dysfunctional. Maybe that's sort of a nice word. It's not doing really what it was intended to do. And so there are a lot of countries, according to the US administration, that are indulging in policies that are not consistent with what the WTO had done. So these are like subsidizing industries and export subsidies, which we used to have in the past. There's forced technology transfer, which Trump was concerned about. The trade imbalance I've mentioned. Fentanyl is a big problem in the US. And we can see he was concerned not only with China, but also Mexico, and believe it or not, Canada. Apparently a lot of fentanyl comes over the border from Canada. Okay, so fentanyl is a problem. Whether this is a solution or not, you can ask my opinion on that, or have your own opinion. Then, of course, there are security issues with rare earths, critical minerals, and so on. And basically, there's the containment and really suppression of China. So they're the particular problems that the US has with China, at least from the current administration. And I think also the Biden administration has some of these concerns as well. Okay, don't take too much notice of this, apart from the fact that there were, early on this year, the US announced a 10% tariff on China, and the Liberation Day tariffs, they claimed it was going to be 34%. It ratcheted up until it got to 125% in April. And then they came to an agreement, maybe they would just have 10% tariffs and so on. On Liberation Day here, I'll show you in a minute, there were high tariffs announced on a range of countries, including Australia, basically 10% across the board. And then countries got concerned about it, and Trump agreed that they would postpone these tariffs for several months, and then that was extended again until today, 1st of August. And as I mentioned earlier, if you saw the news this morning, then Trump has imposed fairly high tariffs on some countries, but not all. And the most significant for Australia, there was concern about whether the 10% that applies to everybody, would be increased maybe to 15 or 20, but in fact, that's not happened. So it's kept at 10%, but there's high tariffs on countries like Switzerland, Vietnam, Bangladesh, some strange places where there's practically no trade. For example, with Switzerland, okay, what are they exporting in terms of goods, Swiss watches and so on? but they're mainly service. They're mainly a service sector, and so Trump has not really been too concerned about services trade, which of course tend to go the other way. So that's the timeline, and to extend that, now we've talked about critical minerals, as I've said, restrictions on technology, student visas. I guess students are lucky they can come here and not to the US, so some of them are being restricted. And as I said, Liberation Day was paused, extended until today. Okay, you can't see that, but this is an iconic photograph now, where China was on the top, and the reciprocal tariffs was going to be 34%. What it doesn't show that there are some countries like Lesotho in the middle of Africa, who produces textiles and not much else. They have a tariff of 50%. And most importantly here, Vietnam was 46%. And the reason for that is transshipment. So China was either transshipping goods through Vietnam, or they're relocating their production into Vietnam, and those goods were coming through there. So that's why there were high tariffs on things like that. You may recall there was a bit of an issue that tariffs were also imposed on Heard Island or Macquarie Island, places that didn't actually export anything, but potentially they could have been used for transshipment. So that's why some of those countries had high tariffs. So these are the Liberation Day tariffs, and you can see Australia here in the red is 10% generally, but Canada and Mexico, who have the what used to be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, renamed, but they're on the border. They have most of the trade, 25%, and China, at that time, we got 34%. And most of the other countries, from my point of view, UNCTAD's point of view, we're looking at small island developing states here and in the Caribbean and Africa. LDCs, they're the countries that we were interested in from the UN's perspective, with whom I did this modelling. But most countries 10%, which is, so that's like a harmonised tax, basically. Everyone's 10%. And there is merit in that approach. And Australia has pushed for an exemption, which I think they're unlikely to get. But nonetheless, they pushed that. So the EU was pretty high. Last night they announced it was going to be 15% of the EU, etc. So these are called Annex 1 tariffs. There's also an Annex 2, which means there are lots of exemptions to this. There are 1,100 products which are exempt from these specific tariffs. So in that way, they're moving away from a harmonised tariff, which I think is a bad idea. So what we're going to do, I'm going to outline a couple of scenarios, talk briefly about the model. We have some results, some implications we can draw, caveats we will brush over, and you can ask me about at question time. So far, so good. That's by way of introduction. So the tariff I just showed you, we're going to model those Liberation Day tariffs. Just suppose the US imposes these tariffs on all of these countries, then who's going to gain and lose from that? Well, the US is going to lose. We would like to know how much. Is it a big problem for them or not? And what's it like for us? Now, part of the discussion which concerned the US is suppose everybody else put on retaliatory tariffs, which are exactly the same. Would the US be much worse off? Would other countries be better off, etc.? And the third scenario is, well, what I think is a likely outcome. Now, if I was presenting this tomorrow, maybe I would change some of these numbers. But I think, you know, when all the negotiations have gone through, then some of these, we settle down to something like this. Canada and Mexico have a 35% we learned this morning. China, they've got another, I think, 10 days or a week before they agree to what that's going to be. This stays the same. These exemptions, there are 25% on these products. There are these exemptions. There's this issue about copper, which is in the news, and that was changed just yesterday as well. As I say, all of this subject to change without notice, and we'll see what the likely effects are. A pretty standard trade model, which we use for everything. I've typed like this. The main point is it handles bilateral trade. So when you have differential tariff rates, then it can accommodate that. And the models tend to be driven. When you have high tariff rates on China, low tariff rates on Australia, we're getting a switching of goods. 17, we projected out to the most recent data that we have, update the tariffs. We talk here about the closure and the tariffs, which makes it easy for me, on top of the existing tariff. So for many countries like China, the average tariff is 2%. But we're adding these tariffs on top of what they have. Okay, now, this is the key slide. Maybe you take a photograph of this and you can forget the rest. And by the way, you know, so these, you can have a copy of all of these slides. They'll be available downline this afternoon, I'm sure. So what's the story here? Firstly, I'll run through this quickly and then show you some graphs to make it a little bit easier. So we can see the key number is the US imposes tariffs, GDP, annual GDP reduces 0.4%. So it's not 1% or 2%. It's not a recession. Once all these things, all these factors have worked through, in the long run, we get a minimal impact on the US GDP, real GDP. If countries retaliate, okay, the US is affected, there's a negative effect. So it's -6. So it's not such a big impact that the US is likely to be worried about. Basically, they don't trade all that much, right? So they can manage if their trade is reduced. And we can see here, you know, how much it is reduced, right? So these are big numbers. Initially, it's a 15% reduction in trade. And, well, you know, the average tariff is 16%, and we're getting a percentage change in trade like that, which is a big number. And when there's retaliation, you know, imports also drop further. There's a change in exports because they can't export so far. We quantify the impact on the trade balance. It doesn't get better, it gets worse, which is counter to what they were hoping. There's tariff revenue that's raised, but not enough really to reduce income tax. So that was Trump's idea. We reduce income tax somewhat by raising this tariff revenue. And of course, his idea is foreign countries are paying for this. But we can see, well, that actually doesn't happen. But they do raise some revenue, which we quantify. What happens to prices? Now, this is interesting. So there's quite a big increase in prices here, but it is once off. So it's like putting on a sales tax, a GST. We get an increase in prices in a particular year, but it doesn't keep increasing. Now, if you're a macroeconomist, you'll raise an objection here, which has some validity. Once we have an increase in prices, it builds into expectations. And this is a key point that the macroeconomists discuss. You know, does it sink back down? Or do we keep having a high period of inflation? So I'm betting that it's just a one-off effect. And there are other modellers who use different techniques who've come to that conclusion. What happens to the people who matter? What happens to real wages? And in the modelling, we have 5 different types of labour. So basically, there's unskilled agricultural workers, technicians, clerical staff, service staff, etc. The effects are reasonably the same, but they're disadvantaged. So they're made worse off in real terms, pretty much across the board of all labour types. So let's illustrate this in more detail. So here's a chart of the GDP, and you can see, you know, much as I said, you know, 0.4 when they impose their own tariffs. If there's retaliation, there's a bit more of a loss, and we have that. What I think is the likely outcome, you know, 0.2 of the GDP per year. So that's not we haven't got to that point yet, but that's not a disaster, but it is a negative impact. So there are, from the US point of view, I think, you know, no benefits there. Of course, we haven't taken into account the distributional effects. There are winners and losers, but we don't have it identified. Okay, so we saw this point. What happens to imports and exports? As I said, big changes here. And when there's retaliation, there's even bigger changes on both imports and exports here. So, for example, you know, with the retaliation, 35% change in imports. That's a big number. Here's that trade balance, and again we see the retaliation. It actually improves the trade balance compared to, you know, the first round effects. And actually, this is tied not only to imports and exports, but also to investment flows, savings and investment flows, because the capital account has to equate to the current account. And basically, this is the problem that the US has. At the moment, they get a lot of savings China is surplus in savings, and it has to go somewhere. A lot of it comes into the US, and that's why they, you know, have a trade deficit unless they adjust their exchange rate. You know, to offset that. Average tariffs, as I mentioned. So the US tariffs 16%. If retaliation occurs, it pretty much stays the same. Not exactly, because, you know, these are trade weighted and trade changes. 16% is pretty high. I mean, it's now 2 or 3, but a few years ago, before the first round of Trump, it was 2 or 3%, particularly on agriculture and specific textiles and specific goods. In the past, it has been 30, average tariffs of 30, maybe 40% back in the 30s and 40s and so on. Now we think that was a bad idea, and the 16% tariff is a bad idea. I think it'll come down to average of, you know, 4 or 5%. But then, you know, with Trump, it's a little bit difficult to know because he seems to do things on a whim. It's difficult to predict the tariffs he's likely to set on a particular country, like Switzerland or Vietnam. And at one point, there was some talk about, you know, there was a formula, but that didn't seem to be particularly consistent. So here's prices and wages again. Okay, so I've got the CPI and I've got real wages. So once again, I see, you know, a big impact on the CPI, but, you know, real wages particularly hit hard So this is the minus, 1.9. So if countries retaliate, that's a problem. But we notice here that prices are going down. And what's happening there? In the first instance, we're paying more because of the tariffs have gone up. Importers have to pass on those costs. Prices rise, as we said, so this is a one-off effect. In this case, the US can't export to all the countries it was previously exporting to because it's facing high tariffs pretty much everywhere. And then it has to sell onto the domestic market. And that drives down these domestic prices. But it also drives real wages down a little bit further. So I find that an interesting result. Once again, as I said, one-off price changes. It won't cause inflation going on forever. Okay, so what we want to know is which countries are affected and also what commodities are affected. So the real GDP, I mentioned the US here in these lines, the first and the second scenarios. Australia is here. And what we notice in the first scenario, okay, so this is a counterintuitive story. In the first scenario, US imposes tariffs, Australia gains. Now you haven't read this in the West Australian.
A tiny amount. Gains a tiny amount.
A tiny amount, yes. Yeah. But it's not a loss. And we were thinking, it'll be a disaster. The stock market will have an adverse effect. Well, maybe the stock market is not the economy. It's people reacting, etc., or overreacting, in my opinion. But so what's happening here is that, China is locked out of the US market, as well as Vietnam and many other countries. And Australia can fill that role by firstly exporting to the US in various goods, but also in the second instance, if China retaliates and imposes imports on the US, then there's that market for Australia to supply the US. So what's China importing from the US? Well, firstly, grains to feed its livestock, to feed all of its people. So maybe there are opportunities there, but one of the things we notice with just US tariffs alone, there are a lot of countries here that may benefit. So we can see those yellow bars, some of them are positive. So in fact, there are many countries that may benefit. And here's my personal problem with the SIDS and the LDCs. We can see they can export some of those goods that those countries were previously supplying to the US. So my story there, Australia may gain fractionally, or at least it won't lose. When it comes to retaliate, everybody retaliates, pretty much everybody loses. I think Argentina, Emmanuel, is an exception for some.
And Brazil with the 50% that they will get.
So, there's an interesting story of who gains and who loses. It's not that everybody's worse off. Firstly, America's worse off. And if retaliation occurs, well, we can see the effects. The effects there. So that's GDP by region.
Clarification, just another question. That's the big blue one coming down, is that right? As in the one who's really hammered.
Yeah. So Vietnam, as you recall from that iconic slide, I think they were the top of 46% we had on there. And as I said, that's because US was concerned about transshipment from China. And I recall reading an article in the New York Times about rules of origin with a guy who was importing bicycles. They were made in China, but he would repatch them. And the customs officers, they they're too busy to actually check about rules of origin. And one of the things I've noticed in the past, if you look at free trade agreements, particularly with the European Union, there can be 600 pages on rules of origin and how you treat every particular article. So that's a concern. Implementation, of course, is a problem. So the US administration knows about this, and they tried to get around it by imposing tariffs, particularly on a lot of Southeast Asian countries, including Bangladesh, Vietnam, Cambodia, who are not really powerhouses in the economic world, but they get this huge tariff on them.
We have 9 minutes to go.
Sorry?
9 minutes to go.
Good. So here we talk about where the imports are coming from, different countries. So these are in values, dollar values, and we can see the European Union, China, small amounts from various other countries there. So that tariff that they put on this morning on the European Union, 15%, that's fairly significant. So this is on goods. Of course, there's also services trade, which is neglected here. And Australia, as mentioned, has a small amount of trade with the US. And of course, the countries with the biggest trade, they're the ones that are going to be most affected. What about by sector? The US imports by sector. You can see here it's all in the industrial goods. You don't know what this means, but basically there's agricultural here, raw materials here, industrial goods. Yeah, so it's mainly in the industrial sector, not so much agriculture. Okay, so what about change in Australian exports? Because I'm here with an audience that is interested in agriculture. So we see a fall in minerals and metals, partly because, you know, as we do read in the news, that if China can't export white goods, metal products and so on to the US, there'll be less demand for minerals and energy products, minerals and metal products. So we see this here. So quite a drop in some of these products, but the resources can shift elsewhere. We see there's an increase in demand for wheat, coarse grains, plant fibers, that's cotton, beef and sheep meat, and some of these other products. Now, you know, perhaps a relevant criticism is I'm saying, well, you know, if China can't import from the US coarse grains from the US to feed their pigs and chickens and what have you, can we supply it? Right? So these are the coarse grains group. And the question is whether we can produce soya beans, sorghum, some of the other products that Brazil, other countries can supply. And it's because obviously we've aggregated the coarse grains together. Can we produce what China actually wants? Beef and sheep meat. So we're selling, you know, there's a market for that somewhere. Of course, all of these goods have protocols. You know, what do you do if you're exporting wheat to China or another country and the customs officer says, look, I found a rat? Well, there's a protocol for dealing with this. Right? And I remember Australian Wheat Board, they used to pay a bribe to get around this particular problem. So that encouraged the supply of rats we found in ships, etc. But so when you trade, you do need these protocols, how to handle these things. But my point is, there are opportunities here. Okay, sell your mining and metals shares. But still hope if you're producing these agricultural exports. Okay. So I've probably got 5 minutes left now, have I?
Yes, we have more questions, more time for questions.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. I've still got a couple of slides to make these main points. Okay, so these tariff policies are bad. They don't meet the stated objectives. The second point is they're not catastrophic. So in the worst case for the US, a 0.6% loss, although there is a decrease in real wages, right? So the people they want to benefit most, Trump's constituency, his supporters, they probably don't benefit because he's focusing on the wrong problems. I think the price effects are one-off. So it's not as if we have inflation and it builds into expectations. There's an interesting story in the press about what's happened to the prices so far, and exporters have tended to absorb some of those high tariffs. They haven't passed them on as yet. Like they did in the previous Trump administration, that did build into the prices. So as far they haven't. I say without retaliation, most countries gain from these effects. When I say most, right, there are many little countries who are gained because basically China's sort of locked out. And this is because of trade diversion. Obviously, it depends on our elasticities in the model, how quickly you can, how readily you can switch from one country to another. We know, Canadian wheat is not the same as Australian wheat, but it is substitutable to a varying degree. Retaliation is self-harming from an economic perspective. Maybe politically it works, but from what we saw today, last night, I'm not even sure that is the case. Some countries have come to a deal with the US, but many others haven't as yet. Most of them probably get the 10% general. And as I said, opportunities for the rural sector. Now, caveats. Usually I rush over these fairly quickly, but maybe you're the most interested in the limitations of this work. So, deal or no deal? Is Trump going to come to a deal or not? And Australia's pressing to have the 10% removed. I don't think that will happen. And the real question is, what might happen with China? Where are we going to end up there? And we can see, so Trump sometimes referred to as TACO. Trump always chickens out. He says, we're going to put on a high tariff against China, but then there are all these exceptions. For example, 1,100 exceptions in what I showed was an Annex 2 statement. And then there's critical minerals, there's rare earths, what he calls raw earths, so we're not sure, there's policy uncertainty which we can see, we hope to take into account, we don't know. Here's a real issue. There's no account of the cost of adjustment. And if we think Trump's going to impose tariffs and then they're going to be wound back in the next administration, you don't want to invest in your cattle or sheep or various other things if you think the policies are going to change in 4 years' time. But remember, in the first Trump administration, he put on high tariffs. Biden kept them and added some more. And so you've got to think about, what's going to happen there. So there's a cost of adjustment. We don't take that into account. And because of the uncertainty, we get, who wants to invest when you don't know what's going to happen? So that's a problem. So this is a static model where we basically say this is the new equilibrium where everything's moved. We don't trace this path. For example, we can see prices are going to go up and then inflation is probably going to come down after 3 or 4 years, it will go down. So we don't trace the path that some other people have tried to do. And we've got an issue that I mentioned before, one-off prices. Do they build into inflation? And that will affect how the Federal Reserve or the Reserve Bank affects interest rates, and that'll have more implications throughout the economy. Now, I think I've come to the point where you give your opinion about what you think will happen. Thank you very much. Good timing, don't you think?
40 minutes and 4 seconds. So I have been instructed by Michael to handle the Q&A,
Yeah, sure.
to first ask if there are PhD students with questions. Is that the case?
Yeah, I have one question.
Okay.
So what is the retaliation tariff?
Sorry?
What is the retaliation tariff that countries could impose against the US?
So the way we've done this, and there was a fair bit of speculation earlier on when these tariffs were imposed. So the notion was that countries would impose the same tariff on the US that was imposed on them, right? So in Australia's case, the US is a 10% across the board tariff, and a retaliatory tariff is we would impose that same tariff on US imports. Now, of course, what's happened since there's been all this exceptions. So those first tariffs were called Annex 1, but a little bit later they came out with something Annex 2 with all these exceptions for 1,100 products. And then the question is, well, how do you put tariffs on things you don't even import, maybe, right? So, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But the way we modeled it is, if the country imposes a general tariff, across the board, and then you see, bad effects all around. Now, as the negotiations go on, you see a lot of exceptions coming in, particularly on the critical earths, copper, aluminium, and steel, various minerals and so on. But that's how we modeled it.
Any other questions from PhD students?
So I have two. I was just
only
curious.
one.
Sorry.
Only one.
Just build it up.
You put them together, put A and a B question.
It's a part deal. Yeah? The first question is, I was curious about which LDCs were benefiting from this particular tariff process.
Yep.
And the second one, building upon it, is you've already touched upon the inflation part of it. It's just, difficult to accept that it's not going to build up on the prices later on in the future. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, so on the LDCs, so a limitation of the modelling. I think we have 160 countries in the model, but out of, well, let's say the UN designates 220 countries, some of which I've never heard of, like St. Kitts or Grenadier, and we have those in the model. We have to aggregate the model to maybe 30, 35 regions. And there are many LDCs that are grouped together, like the Caribbean and so on. So it's hard for us to disaggregate them individually. So we tend to have those in, several groups and doing the best we can. Given the fact often there's no data, input-output data, for example, in some of these countries, which makes it so difficult for us. We did separate out Bangladesh, I think, and Pakistan. Do you call that a less developed country? Borderline, right? But basically, pretty much we have them grouped together, so we can't really answer your question. But because they tend to be treated the same way, we're having a 10% tariff, then most of those should benefit to the extent that they can supply textiles or alternative products that countries like Vietnam or Cambodia or other ones that have been shut out can supply. Now, on that inflation thing, so maybe the best comparison is like a GST. You put it on 10% and it stays like that. Right? So you're not building price increase every year as if there's an increase in the cost of production. In fact, Kamala Harris, you remember her? Yeah. She said, oh no, Trump's tariffs, that's really like a sales tax. And I think she's right, really, because the notion then was that it would be 10% across the board. Well, you might as well put it on a sales tax to raise revenue. The difference is Trump wanted these tariffs to be paid by foreigners. And that's reliant on the fact that there are these terms of trade effects that the price drops when we're exporting to the US. If there's a tariff, we absorb some of that price impact. So not all of the 10% is passed on. Maybe it's 8 or 7 or something, And we quantify what that effect is, because we can calculate the terms of trade effects, etc., in the model. And you might question that. And I think I said a moment ago, I mean, there was a story in the newspapers that so far, then exporters have absorbed the cost, whereas in the previous Trump administration, importers paid the cost. Now, what I'm saying is we expect that most of the cost will be borne by US consumers. And how much? Well, in the first round we get, so that's a 16% tariff. Prices rise 4 or 5%. So, but as I claim, that's one-off and it doesn't build into inflation affect interest rates in the longer term. So that's a long answer to two short questions. Any more questions, sir?
There's one online, but we can read in a few minutes. Is there any other questions? Yeah.
So I think I knew the answer before you told me, because most trade models kind of come out this way. But it seems to me the big effect of all of this is going to be in the services sector. Countries are just going to get jack of the US and start putting, well, reinventing the financial system, and the US is going to end up not being able to borrow from the rest of the world. So this is pure speculation, not in your model. But what do you think will happen with services and other things?
Okay, yeah, so that's an interesting thing. Here I show all of these sectors, but these are all goods, and there are some services sector here. And in the modelling, I find this is quite interesting. So let's categorise it. What does Australia produce? Right, agriculture, minerals, tourism, and education are the primary exports, which is a pretty gross generalisation. Now, what we see happening in the model is labour comes, for Australia, labour comes out of these sectors and they actually go into the service sector. So Australia starts exporting services like insurance, accounting, legal services, health, education, etc., to the US and other countries in the model. Now, your question is, can we take someone who's working in the mineral sector and have them working in the services sector providing health services? And you might say, well, that's a bit of a stretch, but at the margin, so that's the sort of thing that, the model suggests we get a reallocation over time, we get a reallocation towards the service sector, which doesn't feature in Trump's analysis at all. He's only got the tariffs on goods, not in services. So we expect a greater trade in the over time in the services sector. Now you're saying, well, we get sick of Trump and we focus on other things. More likely we trade with other countries because what goes around eventually comes around. There are things like copper that the world's going to need. We still need grains and so on to feed all the pigs that we're going to eat. It's got to come from somewhere, but it'll move around and essentially be reallocated. So am I pessimistic about that? No, we can survive this, but there will be a move, will be a need to adjust, between some of these sectors.
There's a question online. I think you have already clarified it.
Right.
But
let's hear it again.
It says, thank you, insightful presentation of that. And since you have already noted that the digital model is static, have you considered exploring dynamic CG models or even partial equilibrium approaches to enhance the depth of your analysis?
Well, the answer is we have considered it. So sometimes we run this in a recursive dynamic framework, but we think Trump is a one. And we don't need to go out 5 or 10 or 15 years as we do if we're phasing in a free trade agreement or something. Now there are other guys that do have dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, particularly central banks and so on, and they're focused on the exchange rate and interest rates and other factors. Now this is GTAP is effectively a trade model. As I said, we don't trace the path to the new equilibrium, but we think we know what the new equilibrium is. But other guys have looked at it and they said, well, you know, we'll get an inflationary impact and then it will drop back. And the same with employment, real wages. Maybe they go up before they go down and so on. And that's of interest, particularly in the short run. So, I mean, it is a valid suggestion. But if you have those dynamic models, often you can't get the sectoral disaggregation that we have here. So in a sense, you're losing something by gaining some of those dynamic effects. But look, why don't you try some dynamic stochastic general equilibrium yourself? So you can easily fit it into your PhD if you've got you know, several months to go. You can almost get them off the shelf.
How much does it cost to use?
Yeah, well, there's a licensing problem.
Okay, Michael?
I'm just thinking the retaliation issue isn't really an economic policy. It's a political one, presumably, as in you're not expecting, hoping that this is going to be the outcome. You're hoping this is going to be the starting point of everything being reduced back down again. And it's a negotiating strategy to say, okay, this is obviously madness. Let's cut all these tariffs back down to something more sensible. Do you have any sense as to whether that strategy could work, or do people have a sense that that's going to work? That this,
well, I mean, spoken like a European, which is what the European Union did, and also the Canadians and the Chinese, whereas in Australia we haven't done it. And even Jim Chalmers said, no, we're not going to do that. Right? We're not going to retaliate. But on the other hand, it was only 10%. But so does it work? I mean, I think it is a characteristic of Trump that I mean, the bargaining approach is, you know, put up a really high price and let it come down again. And we've seen that happen. But maybe it happened even if the countries didn't retaliate. Now, what I've tried to show, these policies are a bad idea. What I don't show is, you know, maybe there are distributional effects, that there are some beneficiaries within the US, maybe, you know, some type of manufacturers, etc. Those who may be manufacturing copper or steel or something like that. So there may be localized beneficiaries, but in general, it doesn't work. And as you point out, you know, I think after a while, it's the bond market that matters. When they think people will no longer want to lend to the US because the policies are so bad, then they will react and Trump will take any notice, and then the tariffs will come down, I think. But whether retaliation makes a difference to the eventual outcome, and that's you know, difficult to say.
But they're retaliating to the bond market.
Well, at the moment, the bond hasn't reacted that much until on Liberation Day, just after that, on the 2nd of April, then the bond market reacted and Trump said, we'll give it another 3 months. And you remember Liz Truss?
Barely.
Well, you should, because I think she had a good economic policy that wasn't sold very well. The bond market reacted, and within a very short period, we had a new prime minister. And so I mean, the bond markets are important because that, in some ways, is a reflection of what people are thinking of the way the economy is going to move. And that is, I think, is what Trump reacts to. And at some point, he's going to say, well, you know, this is having a negative effect. Let's make a deal.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. That's really great. I'm curious about how you think of inflationary pressures from uncertainty, something I haven't really been able to capture in here, because like it's such a big complaint of businesses in the States is that we can't plan. We have no idea what the tariff's going to be in 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. So when you're writing contracts for a year in advance, you're pricing in some sort of uncertainty effect, which could have inflationary pressure. So I wonder how you think about that. Is it big? Should we not worry about it?
So I think what happens is, as I indicated in one of the slides, is firms don't invest.
Yeah.
But those who have already invested, they keep doing what they're doing, hoping, you know, maybe it won't be too bad. But you're not going to invest in new things if you think that after, in 2 or 3 years that Trump's going to be gone and things, and the Democrats maybe will reverse, or maybe it'll be Vance and he will keep going with some of this. But basically you don't know what's happening. So that means you're not going to invest, but I think it means you keep doing what you're doing unless you have a reason for thinking otherwise.
Yeah.
How this feeds through to inflation. So I've used this GST example, but it is true, and this is the main macroeconomic issue. People think, oh, there's going to be inflation. And if those expectations are built in, then you get ongoing inflation. But you can see with the current period of inflation, after COVID, where there was all that stimulus, now in Australia and most other countries, it's come down to within the band, 2 or 3%, because